Naomi served drinks at the Luminary Hotel's restaurant every night. Poised and invisible in her neat dark uniform, she was just another server catering to the city's wealthy elites. Nobody knew what she was running from. Her hidden past had taught her how to read a room, how to spot the unnatural bulge of a concealed weapon, and how to recognize a Russian syndicate operative in disguise. Now it was just Naomi, keeping her head down, pouring wine and watching the shadows. She'd seen the restaurant's most feared VIP only a few times. Shin Jae-won, powerful, handsome, cold. He was the kind of man who looked right through the staff as if they were part of the marble floors. Tonight he was seated across from a new business partner. But Naomi recognized the man's telltale micro-expressions. And at 8:47 p.m. on a Friday, as the man subtly shifted his weight, she saw the distinct grip of a suppressed weapon under his coat. She looked at Jae-won's two stern bodyguards scanning the room, completely oblivious to the threat at the table, and knew a deadly trap was about to spring. 8:30 p.m., 17 minutes before. Shin Jae-won sat at his reserved table under the golden lighting, a predator in a tailored black suit. He had built his criminal empire through absolute authority and brutal indifference. To Jae-won, people were pawns, compassion was a fatal weakness, and trust was a luxury he had long ago discarded. His phone buzzed. A text from his lieutenant. Perimeter secure, boss. Jae-won checked his watch. 8:31 p.m. Right on schedule. He thrived on the predictability of dominance. Arrive at 8:15, negotiate at 8:30, seal the territory deal by 9 o'clock. No deviations, no mercy. The new Russian associate smiled across the table, lifting his crystal glass in a toast. The dining room of the Luminary Hotel was a masterpiece of deception. Beneath the cascade of golden chandeliers and the soft rhythmic clink of crystal, the air hummed with a tension only the hunted could feel. Naomi balanced a silver tray holding a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir, her dark server uniform blending into the shadows of the room. She moved gracefully across the gleaming marble floors, every step measured, every breath controlled. To the wealthy patrons, this restaurant was a playground. To Naomi, it was a gilded cage, and tonight she was locked inside with apex predators. She approached the corner booth, a secluded epicenter of power where Shin Jae-won held court. He sat with spine-snapping perfect posture, his tailored black suit absorbing the ambient light. He emanated a frigid, calculated indifference, viewing the world and everyone in it as tools to be used or obstacles to be crushed. When Naomi stepped to his side to pour the wine, he didn't even glance up. She was entirely invisible to him, a mere phantom meant to serve and vanish. It was a cruel, impenetrable coldness she recognized, the armor of a man who had burned away his own humanity to build an empire, leaving no room for sentiment or mercy. But Naomi wasn't looking at Jae-won. Her sharp, intelligent gaze flicked to the man sitting across from him. The so-called business partner wore an expensive suit and a practiced, genial smile, but his eyes were entirely dead. As he reached for his water glass, his jacket shifted a fraction of an inch. Naomi's breath hitched. It wasn't just the unnatural weight stretching the fabric near his ribs. It was the way his hand hovered, the tension in his knuckles, the predatory stillness in his shoulders. She had seen that exact posture before. In a past life she had bled to escape. The two tall bodyguards standing a few paces behind Jae-won scanned the perimeter with disciplined vigilance, looking for external threats. They were watching the doors, the other tables, the windows. They weren't looking at the smiling man already sitting at the table. Naomi poured the dark red wine into the operative's glass, her hand perfectly steady despite the alarm bells screaming in her mind. She moved to Jae-won's right, lifting the bottle over his crystal glass. The air around the Mafia boss was practically freezing, heavy with the weight of his absolute authority. He was utterly detached, a king waiting for his tribute, oblivious to the fact that the man across from him was silently shifting his weight, preparing to draw. Naomi had seconds to decide. She could walk away, preserve her own invisible existence, or step directly into the crosshairs of a man whose ruthlessness was legendary. She took a slow, steadying breath, the scent of expensive wine and impending violence thick in her lungs, and made her choice. To the oblivious diners, the man smiling across from Shin Jae-won was just another wealthy investor negotiating a lucrative deal. But Naomi knew the anatomy of a killer. She had learned it the hard way. Surviving on the razor's edge of a violent underworld, she had fled thousands of miles to escape. Her hidden past was a graveyard of memories filled with men who smiled exactly like that. Men with hollow dead eyes and a practiced genial warmth that never quite reached the frozen muscles of their faces. As she stepped closer to the table, the scent of expensive cologne and roasted meats masked the metallic tang of impending violence, but Naomi's senses were already dialed to a lethal frequency. She noted the stranger's hands. His left hand rested casually on the tablecloth, but his right hand remained subtly hovering near his lapel. The fabric of his custom jacket pulled imperceptibly across his left ribcage. It wasn't the bulk of a wallet or a phone. It was the distinct rigid line of a concealed weapon, a Russian syndicate standard. Jaewon sat opposite the operative, a portrait of dark, terrifying majesty. He radiated a cruel, impenetrable indifference, his sharp jawline clenched as he listened to the man's fabricated pitch. He was a king who had built his empire on ruthlessness and absolute control. His arrogance was his armor. He was so accustomed to being the most dangerous predator in any room that he couldn't see the wolf sitting right at his table. He was a man who operated solely on fear and power, entirely detached from the kind of loyalty and awareness that couldn't be bought. Naomi's pulse hammered against her ribs as she moved around the booth. The two monolithic bodyguards standing behind Jaewon were focused outward, scanning the golden-lit room and the marble floors for external threats. They were looking for an invasion, completely blind to the executioner already inside the gates. She reached Jaewon's side. The sheer gravitational pull of his presence was overwhelming, a dangerous, chilling energy that commanded immediate submission. To him, she was less than a ghost, a silent server holding a bottle of vintage wine. But Naomi knew that in mere seconds, the smiling man would draw his weapon. The opulent dining room would become a slaughterhouse. She had sworn never to entangle herself with dangerous men again. She had promised herself a quiet, invisible life. But as the Russian operative's fingers twitched toward his coat, Naomi realized she could not stand by and let this ruthless king fall to a coward's trap. She gripped the cool glass of the wine bottle, stepping out of the shadows and crossing the invisible boundary between a nameless servant and a deadly player in his game. The distance between Naomi and Shin Jae-won was only a few feet, but crossing it felt like stepping into the epicenter of a storm. She approached his right side, her posture carefully constructed to appear submissive, masking the adrenaline roaring through her veins. The two bodyguards looming in the shadows behind him didn't even flinch. She was wearing the uniform, holding the bottle, perfectly playing the part of an invisible servant. But her eyes were locked on the Russian operative's hand, which was now sliding deliberately toward the inner lapel of his coat. Jaewon leaned back in his chair, his expression a mask of beautiful, cruel indifference. He was a man who ruled his empire through absolute dominance, demanding immediate, unquestioning submission from everyone in his orbit. He operated in a brutal world devoid of genuine loyalty, surrounded by a cold isolation of his own, making where true devotion was a myth, and everyone was ultimately expendable. As Naomi stepped directly into his personal space, the sheer, suffocating weight of his authority washed over her. He fully expected her to pour the wine, bow her head, and vanish back into the scenery. Instead, Naomi broke every rule of her own survival. She tilted the heavy bottle of vintage Pinot Noir, the dark red liquid flowing smoothly into the bowl of his crystal glass. Across the table, the assassin shifted his weight, his fingers finally brushing the concealed grip of his weapon. It was now or never. Pretending to reach across the linen tablecloth to adjust a piece of silver, Naomi closed the agonizing distance between them. She leaned in intimately close, her dark uniform brushing the pristine, expensive wool of Jaewon's suit. The scent of him, cedar, smoke, and raw, unapologetic power, was intoxicating, but she couldn't let it shatter her focus. She lowered her head until her lips were mere inches from the sharp curve of his jaw. To the rest of the opulent, golden-lit dining room, it looked like nothing more than a waitress offering a polite, hushed inquiry about the meal. But beneath the clatter of fine china and the hum of conversation, Naomi's voice sliced through the tension with quiet, desperate urgency. "Don't trust him," she breathed, her words meant for Jaewon alone. The Russian sent him. For a fraction of a second, the entire world seemed to stop spinning. Jaewon's body went completely rigid. The terrifying, cold detachment that defined him fractured in an instant. Slowly, his dark, intense gaze snapped from the man sitting across the table directly to the woman leaning over his shoulder. Up close, his eyes were a dangerous, bottomless black. They didn't hold panic. they held a sudden violent realization and a striking flash of obsession. In that singular heartbeat, the massive power imbalance between the ruthless kingpin and the invisible waitress shifted. Naomi had not just exposed a killer. She had actively challenged his control, forcing the devil to truly look at her. For a fraction of a second, time suspended itself in the golden glow of the chandelier. Jae-won's dark eyes locked onto Naomi's, piercing through her server uniform to truly see the woman breathing against his shoulder. He had spent his entire life ruling through cruelty and isolation, treating everyone around him as expendable collateral. But the fierce, intelligent defiance in her gaze shattered something fundamental within his cold armor. Instead of dismissing the invisible waitress, he believed her. In a blur of calculated violence, the frozen tableau of the dining room shattered. Jae-won didn't shout or recoil. With terrifying fluid precision, his left hand shot across the linen tablecloth, gripping the Russian operative's wrist just as the assassin's concealed weapon cleared his jacket. A sickening crack echoed beneath the soft jazz music as Jae-won fractured the man's arm, pinning the barrel of the gun to the table. The two monolithic bodyguards behind Jae-won reacted a millisecond later, their own suppressed weapons drawn, turning the elegant dining area into a lethal crossfire. Patrons screamed, chairs overturned, and the sharp scent of gunpowder instantly overpowered the aroma of roasted meats and vintage wine. Normally, a man as indifferent and guarded as Shin Jae-won would have used anyone nearby as a human shield, leaving the innocent to bear the brunt of the chaos. But as the assassin's backup lunged from a nearby booth, Jae-won did the unthinkable. The first spark of a dangerous, unfamiliar devotion ignited in his chest. He hooked his arm around Naomi's waist, his massive hand gripping her tightly as he pulled her out of the firing line. He twisted his body, sacrificing his own safety as they crashed behind the heavy marble pillar of the restaurant, shielding her from the showering shards of crystal and lead. Naomi gasped, her hands instinctively clutching the lapels of his ruined, expensive suit. Her heart hammered wildly against his chest, their bodies pressed together in the suffocating dark of their makeshift cover. Above them, the swift, brutal execution of the Russian syndicate played out in muted thuds and suppressed gunfire, but Jae-won wasn't looking at the carnage. He was looking down at her. The chilling authority was still there, carving out the sharp lines of his jaw, but the absolute emotional detachment was gone. A possessive, heavy heat radiated from him, shifting the power dynamic irrevocably. She had breached his defenses, defying his control and saving his life without asking for permission. As the final body hit the marble floor, signaling his guard's victory, Jae-won's grip on her waist tightened. He had been a ruthless monster shaped by betrayal and blood, but the woman trembling yet unyielding in his arms had just sparked the beginning of his redemption. He knew with terrifying certainty that he would never let her walk away. The ringing in Naomi's ears began to fade, replaced by the brutal crunch of shattered crystal under heavy combat boots. The opulent dining room was unrecognizable, reduced to a graveyard of splintered mahogany and pooling dark stains on the marble floor. Still pinned behind the heavy pillar, Naomi pushed against Jae-won's solid chest, desperate to reclaim her space and slip back into the anonymity she had meticulously crafted. But the Mafia boss didn't yield. His arm remained a steel band around her waist, anchoring her to the dangerous heat of his body. "Let me go," she demanded, her voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline tearing through her veins. She met his cold, bottomless stare without flinching. "It's over. I did what I had to do. Now let me leave." Jae-won looked down at her, a muscle feathering along his sharp jawline. To the rest of the world he was a ruthless kingpin, a man who viewed human life as expendable currency. Yet, as his men quickly secured the perimeter and began dragging the bodies into the shadows, his focus remained entirely, obsessively, on the waitress who had just spared him from an explosive end. She was defying him, ordering him, a transgression that would normally invite swift, brutal punishment from a man who demanded absolute submission. Instead, her fierce intelligence sent a dangerous spark of fascination straight to his frozen core. "You exposed a Russian syndicate operative," Jae-won stated, his voice a low, lethal rumble that vibrated against her collarbone. "If you walk out those doors, you are dead before sunrise." "I can take care of myself," Naomi shot back, twisting in his grip. She had survived worse than this in her hidden past. She wouldn't trade one predator for another. "Not against them. And certainly not against me," he replied smoothly. He finally stepped back, but kept his towering frame deliberately positioned between her and the exit. He gestured to his surviving bodyguards. Bring her. Before Naomi could dart toward the service doors, the massive guards blocked her path. Panic flared hot and sharp, but she swallowed it down, refusing to cower. Jaewon didn't drag her kicking and screaming. He simply dismantled her every avenue of escape with terrifying efficiency. He was pulling her directly into his violent underworld, locking her inside a gilded cage of his own design. Within moments, she was escorted through a secure private exit and ushered into the cavernous back seat of an armored black SUV. Jaewon slid in beside her, bringing the heavy scent of gunpowder and expensive cedar with him. As the reinforced doors locked with a resounding thud, sealing her inside his fortress on wheels, the massive power imbalance threatened to suffocate her. But as Naomi glared at the man beside her, refusing to break eye contact, she realized he wasn't just taking a prisoner. He was claiming a protectorate, sparking the beginning of a dangerous, possessive loyalty that would turn his entire empire upside down. The armored SUV slid to a halt beneath a towering glass and steel high-rise, the impenetrable fortress of Jaewon's empire. Naomi was ushered into a private elevator, flanked by his silent, monolithic guards, while the Mafia boss stood beside her, his presence a heavy, suffocating shadow. When the steel doors parted, revealing a sprawling, minimalist penthouse bathed in the cold glow of the city skyline, he finally dismissed his men with a sharp flick of his wrist. The heavy doors sealed shut. They were alone. "You will stay here," Jaewon commanded, his voice echoing in the cavernous, dimly lit space. He shed his ruined suit jacket, the dark leather holster strapped to his ribs a stark reminder of the lethal violence they had just escaped. "The perimeter is secure. You will have everything you need, and you will not leave." Naomi didn't move toward the plush velvet sofas or the sweeping floor-to-ceiling windows. She stood rooted to the center of the hardwood floor, her chin tilted up, refusing to let the opulence or the danger intimidate her. "I don't need a cage, no matter how much gold you plate it with," she replied, her tone sharp and completely unyielding. "I warned you because I refused to let cowards win, not because I was looking for a new master." Jaewon froze, his dark, calculating eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. He was a man who ruled through absolute terror and indifferent cruelty. People bowed to him, they bled for him. They certainly did not look him in the eye and speak with such blazing, fearless defiance. He crossed the room with slow, predatory steps until he was standing mere inches from her, using his towering height to cast her entirely in his shadow. "You think this is a game of masters and servants?" he murmured, the cold authority in his tone warring with a strange magnetic heat. "The syndicate that sent that assassin does not forgive. They will peel your life apart piece by piece just to send me a message. Keeping you in this room isn't captivity. It's survival. It's control," Naomi countered instantly, her heart pounding against her ribs, yet she didn't back away a single inch. She looked past the monster everyone feared and spoke directly to the man. "You don't know how to protect without possessing. But I am not your property, Shin Jae-won. If you want my insight, if you want to know how I spotted that operative when your highly paid guards failed, you will treat me as an equal. Otherwise, unlock that door." The silence that followed was deafening, thick with psychological warfare. Jaewon's jaw tightened. The urge to force her into submission was a primal instinct forged by years of ruthless dominance. Yet, as he stared down into her fierce, unapologetic eyes, the absolute ice around his chest fractured. He realized, with a sudden and heavy clarity, that breaking her will would destroy the very fire that had saved his life. Her sheer courage demanded something he had never offered anyone: respect. Slowly, the rigid, terrifying dominance in his posture eased, yielding to a quiet, unfamiliar loyalty. He took a deliberate step back, a silent concession that spoke volumes. In his brutal world, Naomi had just forced the devil to compromise. The penthouse was silent except for the clink of ice against crystal as Jaewon poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He didn't order her to sit. He simply offered her a glass, a silent truce in the wake of her blazing defiance. Naomi accepted it, her fingers briefly brushing his. A fleeting contact that sent a dangerous, heavy jolt of heat through the frigid air between them. "You recognize the concealed carry," Jaewon said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur as he leaned against the mahogany desk. His dark, intense eyes studied her, no longer looking at a servant, but a complex puzzle that had just upended his reality. A waitress doesn't spot a syndicate hitman. Who are you hiding from, Naomi? She took a slow sip, the burn of the liquor steadying the tremor in her chest. She had buried her past so deeply she almost believed the lie of her invisible life. But looking at the towering, formidable boss standing before her, she realized that running was no longer an option. I wasn't always invisible, she began, the weight of years of silence thick in her voice. My father was a forensic accountant, coerced into laundering for the Volkov faction of the Russian syndicate. I grew up with monsters sitting at my dining table. I learned to read their micro-expressions, the way their custom coats pulled over their ribs, the dead look in their eyes right before they decided someone's life was over. She paused, her grip tightening on the heavy glass. When my father tried to buy our way out, they executed him. I ran. I stripped away my identity and my entire life, just to become a nameless girl serving drinks to survive. Jae-won's expression remained an unreadable mask of stone, but the atmosphere around him shifted, thickening with a sudden violent gravity. The Volkov faction, the very same syndicate currently bleeding his territories dry and attempting to usurp his throne. He set his glass down with slow, deliberate precision. The ruthless kingpin who viewed everyone as expendable felt a strange, fierce ache in his chest. A sudden possessive urge to rewrite the tragedies of her past. He had built his entire empire on a foundation of absolute ice after the Volkovs had slaughtered his own mentor years ago. An event that had taught him compassion was a fatal weakness. For a decade, he had operated in a state of calculated, indifferent cruelty, convinced his emotional isolation was his greatest weapon. But as he looked at the resilient, brilliant woman who had stared down a bullet for him, the ice fully cracked. Their fates were inexplicably tethered by the exact same blood-soaked ghosts. They took everything from you, Jae-won stated softly, closing the distance between them. He raised his hand, his knuckles barely grazing the soft curve of her cheek, a gesture of terrifying, unfamiliar devotion from a man who only knew violence. They will never touch you again. From this moment, your enemies are mine. The fragile piece of the penthouse shattered at exactly 2 a.m. The floor-to-ceiling windows, usually offering a glittering panoramic view of the city skyline, suddenly went black as the high-rise primary power grid was severed. An emergency crimson light bathed the minimalist living room in a bloody hue, followed instantly by the shrill, deafening wail of the perimeter breach alarm. The Volkov faction had not waited for dawn to send their message. Before Naomi could even process the sudden plunge into chaos, Jae-won was moving. The Mafia boss, who had been brooding over a map of syndicate territories just moments before, crossed the room with terrifying predatory speed. He didn't issue panicked orders. His face was a mask of absolute lethal calm. He grabbed Naomi's arm, his grip possessive and unyielding, and pulled her behind the heavy steel-reinforced island in the kitchen. They breached the lower security sweeps, Jae-won stated, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut through the blaring sirens. He smoothly drew a heavy, matte black firearm from the holster at his ribs, checking the chamber with practiced mechanical efficiency. Naomi crouched beside him, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, but the panic that should have paralyzed her was eclipsed by a cold, familiar clarity. She had run from these monsters her entire life. She recognized the metallic clank echoing from the walls. Grappling lines, she whispered urgently, her eyes wide as she met his intense gaze in the red emergency lighting. They aren't coming up the elevators. They're scaling the exterior access panels. It's a breach team. Jae-won's dark eyes flashed with a dangerous mixture of surprise and dark admiration. Her intellect was a weapon he hadn't anticipated, a sharp edge that perfectly complemented his own brutal strength. He tapped a secure earpiece. Exterior breach on the west glass. Execute them. The words had barely left his mouth when the reinforced glass of the west wall exploded inward. Shards of glass rained down like jagged diamonds as 3 heavily armed Volkov operatives swung into the penthouse, their assault rifles raised. Jae-won didn't hesitate. Shielding Naomi with his own body, he rose and unleashed a devastating, calculated volley of gunfire. The room erupted in blinding muzzle flashes and the deafening roar of violence. The sheer power and ruthlessness of the Korean kingpin was a terrifying spectacle. He moved like a shadow, dismantling the intruders with cold, indifferent precision, ensuring not a single bullet came near the woman behind him. But as the third operative fell, A secondary blast rocked the floorboards. Smoke poured through the shattered windows, thick and suffocating. The stakes had just multiplied. This wasn't merely an assassination attempt. It was a siege. Jae-won pulled Naomi flush against his chest, his jaw set with a murderous possessive fury. The Volkovs had made a fatal miscalculation. They had brought the war to his home, and threatened the very woman he was rapidly realizing he could not live without. The acrid scent of cordite and pulverized concrete hung thick in the crimson-lit penthouse. Outside the shattered windows, the wail of distant sirens began to rise, but inside, the only sound was the jagged, heavy rhythm of their breathing. Jae-won didn't immediately lower his weapon. He kept his body angled flawlessly between Naomi and the smoking ruin of the west wall, his chest heaving as the last of the lethal adrenaline scorched through his veins. Slowly, he engaged the safety of his firearm and turned. He reached for her, his large hands gripping her shoulders with a bruising, desperate intensity that entirely betrayed the icy facade he wore for the underworld. "Are you hit?" His voice was a raw, gravelly demand. His dark, obsessive eyes frantically mapped every inch of her face and her uniform, checking for blood that wasn't his own. "No," Naomi gasped. Her hands were trembling from the shockwave of the blast, but she forced her spine rigid, refusing to shatter. "I'm fine, Jae-won." Hearing his name on her lips, stripped of honorifics, stripped of the terrified reverence his subordinates used, sent a dangerous, heavy jolt straight to his core. He didn't let go. Instead, he pulled her flush against his chest, backing her firmly against the intact edge of the marble island. The heat radiating from his towering frame was intoxicating, a stark contrast to the cold, calculating monster she knew him to be. Naomi flattened her palms against his ruined dress shirt, intending to push him away. She needed space. She needed to breathe. The volatile power dynamic between them was spiraling rapidly out of her control, twisting from captivity into something far more perilous. But the moment her hands met the hard, hammering wall of his chest, her survival instincts betrayed her. Her fingers curled tightly into his lapels. "You could have died," he murmured, the absolute authority in his tone fracturing into a dark, suffocating possessiveness. He lowered his head, his face mere inches from hers, trapping her in his shadow. "You stepped into a war zone for me at that restaurant. Now they are hunting you." "I didn't ask for your protection," she fired back, her voice breathless but her dark eyes blazing with an unyielding fire that matched his own. "I am not another piece of territory for you to conquer. You are the only thing in this city I cannot afford to lose," Jae-won countered softly. His thumb rose, tracing the sharp line of her jaw with an agonizing tenderness that contradicted the violence of his true nature. The psychological warfare between them suddenly melted into an undeniable, heavy gravity. Every instinct Naomi had honed for survival screamed at her to run from him, but as his lips brushed the corner of her mouth, breathing her in, the emotional conflict boiled over into a consuming fire. She wasn't just his prisoner anymore. She was his ultimate weakness. And as she looked up into his dark, obsessive gaze, she realized with terrifying certainty that he was becoming hers. The blaring sirens outside the shattered penthouse windows finally broke the heavy, suffocating gravity between them. Naomi pulled back from the intoxicating heat of Jae-won's chest, her breath ragged but her mind suddenly razor-sharp. The fleeting, breathless intimacy had ignited a dangerous fire, but she refused to let it consume her sense of self. She was not a fragile prize waiting in a gilded cage while a Mafia king waged a bloody war in her name. "If you keep treating me like a liability to be protected, the Volkovs will outmaneuver you," Naomi said, her voice steadying as she stepped out of his imposing shadow. She smoothed the lapels of her ruined server uniform, replacing the terrified waitress with the brilliant survivor she had always been. "My father didn't just launder their money. He kept their shadow ledgers. I know how they structure their front companies. I know how they move their weapons." Jae-won watched her, his dark eyes still burning with that raw, possessive heat. The instinct to lock her in a vault, to use his massive criminal empire to shield her from every conceivable threat, screamed in his blood. For 10 years he had ruled through absolute dominance and cold isolation, believing that sharing power was the ultimate fatal weakness. But as he looked at the fierce, intelligent woman standing amidst the rubble of his fortress, something fundamental shifted within his chest. His arrogant need for total control yielded to a profound, unfamiliar respect. "You want to step into the crossfire," Jae-won stated, his gravelly voice echoing in the crimson-lit room. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement of her unyielding nature. I want to burn them to the ground, Naomi corrected, her dark gaze locking onto his with a chilling intensity that mirrored his own ruthlessness. You have the soldiers and the firepower. But I have the map to their throat. We stop reacting to their ambushes, and we start hunting. The sheer audacity of her demand hung in the smoke-filled air. A slow, dangerous smirk finally broke the stoic, terrifying mask of the Korean kingpin. It was a look of pure, lethal admiration. He reached out, but this time he didn't grab her with the crushing, immovable grip of a captor. He extended his massive hand, palm open, an offering, a concession, an invitation. They took your family and they dared to strike my home, Jae-won murmured, stepping over the shattered glass to close the distance between them. The cold monster who viewed everyone as disposable tools was gone, replaced by a man willing to sacrifice his own absolute authority for the woman who had saved his life. Show me their ledgers, Naomi. We dismantle them piece by piece. Naomi looked at his extended hand, the ultimate symbol of a shifted paradigm. She placed her hand firmly in his. The solid warmth of his grip sealed their fate. The invisible waitress and the untouchable Mafia boss were gone. In the ruins of his penthouse, surrounded by the blood of their enemies, an unbreakable, deadly alliance was forged. The underground war room was a fortress of steel and glowing monitors, buried deep beneath the city's glittering surface. After the penthouse siege, Jae-won had relocated them to his most heavily fortified sanctuary. Naomi stood over a sprawling digital tactical table, her dark eyes scanning the complex web of shell companies and shipping manifests she had spent the last 2 hours deciphering. Beside her, Jae-won was a towering, quiet force. The ruthless kingpin who had once demanded absolute, unyielding submission from his lieutenants now stood shoulder to shoulder with the woman who was systematically dismantling his enemy's empire. Here, Naomi said, her voice steady as she tapped a glowing coordinate near the industrial harbor. The Volkov faction doesn't just use this shipping front to launder money. It's their primary transit hub for high-grade weaponry. My father flagged discrepancies in their customs payoffs years ago. If you choke off this warehouse, you paralyze their enforcement arm. Across the table, Jae-won's second-in-command shifted uncomfortably, eyeing the former waitress with barely concealed skepticism. With all due respect, boss, hitting the docks leaves our eastern flank completely exposed. We are risking our own men based on a memory from a decade ago. Jae-won didn't raise his voice, but the terrifying, freezing authority in his stare instantly silenced the room. However, instead of the cruel indifference that had defined his reign, there was a new dangerous loyalty burning in his dark eyes, a fierce devotion solely reserved for Naomi. Her word is my command, Jae-won stated, the gravelly absolute of his tone leaving no room for debate. We hit the harbor. We leave the eastern flank open on purpose. It will serve as the bait to draw out their strike teams. He dismissed his men with a sharp flick of his wrist. As the heavy steel doors sealed them in isolation once more, the cold tactician vanished, replaced by a man irreversibly altered by the woman beside him. Jae-won stepped into Naomi's space, the magnetic heat of his massive frame pulling her in. He was no longer the arrogant monster who viewed everyone as expendable pawns. He was actively risking his own empire and offering himself as a shield to secure her vengeance. Setting a trap requires someone to stand in the jaws, Jae-won murmured, his large hand coming up to gently cup the nape of her neck. His thumb stroked her skin, a grounding, possessive tether that contradicted his violent nature. I will lead the assault on the docks myself. I will draw their fire, and I will flush them out for you. Naomi's breath hitched at the magnitude of his sacrifice. The man who had once built impenetrable walls of isolation was now willingly laying down his life and his throne to ensure her survival. She reached up, her fingers wrapping fiercely around his wrist, cementing the deadly trap they had just set. Just make sure you come back to me, she whispered. The underground war room glowed with the cold, sterile light of a dozen surveillance monitors. Naomi stood rigid before the tactical screens, watching the thermal feeds of Jae-won's strike team descending upon the industrial harbor. Rain lashed against the exterior cameras, distorting the shadows, but the digital blips of Jae-won's men moving into position were crystal clear. He was acting as the bait, trusting the trap they had meticulously designed. But as the first breach charges detonated, blowing the warehouse doors off their hinges, A sickening realization turned Naomi's blood to ice. The eastern flank, the deliberate weak point they had left open to draw out the Volkov operatives, was completely empty. Instead, a massive cluster of thermal signatures was converging directly above Jae-won's position on the catwalks. It was a kill box. The Russians hadn't walked into a trap, they had been waiting for him. Naomi's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the encrypted firewalls of Jae-won's own security network. Someone had altered the deployment orders, shifting their sniper support away from the warehouse roof. She pulled up the access logs. The authorization code belonged to the second-in-command, the very lieutenant who had questioned her in the war room hours ago. She slammed her hand down on the comms button, cutting through the static of the tactical channel. Jae-won, pull back. It's a setup. They are above you on the catwalks. Gunfire immediately erupted over the audio feed. A deafening roar of automatic weapons echoing in the cavernous warehouse. Naomi. Jae-won's voice was a low, strained gravel over the comms, punctuated by the sharp crack of his own weapon. Your lieutenant sold you out, she said, her voice trembling with desperate urgency but laced with absolute certainty. He shifted your sniper support. If you push forward into that corridor, you die. You have to break left through the shipping containers. Trust me. In the brutal, paranoid world of the Korean Mafia, a kingpin survived by trusting the men who had bled for him for a decade, not the outsider who had appeared in his life just days ago. The old Shin Jae-won, the cold, indifferent monster who viewed everyone with lethal suspicion, would have dismissed her. He would have trusted his lieutenant, falling victim to his own arrogant isolation. But the silence over the comms stretched for one agonizing, suspended heartbeat. Naomi held her breath. The fragile tether of their new alliance stretched to its absolute limit. Left flank, Jae-won barked over the radio, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestioning loyalty. Move! On the thermal feed, Naomi watched the cluster of his men pivot instantly, narrowly dodging a devastating explosion that vaporized the corridor they had just been ordered to clear. He had chosen her. He had abandoned a decade of ruthless paranoia, anchoring his survival entirely to her intellect. The betrayal of his inner circle had been designed to destroy him, but as he systematically fought his way out of the harbor, his loyal sacrifice only cemented the unbreakable, deadly bond between them. The underground war room plunged into a suffocating pitch-black silence as the tactical monitors abruptly died. Naomi's breath hitched, the sudden darkness a visceral warning. The traitorous lieutenant hadn't just orchestrated an ambush at the docks. He had systematically severed the security grid to the sanctuary itself. He was coming to tie up the final loose end. Naomi didn't freeze. She moved with lethal precision, her fingers wrapping around the cold, heavy grip of the matte black firearm Jae-won had left on the console. She dropped behind the reinforced steel of the tactical table, just as the heavy vault doors blew inward with a deafening concussive roar. Thick, acrid smoke poured into the room, illuminated only by the sweeping crimson laser sights of 3 Volkov mercenaries stepping through the breach. At their center stood Jae-won's lieutenant, his face twisted in a sneer of arrogant triumph. He raised his weapon, scanning the shadows for the waitress who had unraveled his perfect coup. Instead of cowering, Naomi aimed at the emergency generator panel on the wall and pulled the trigger. Sparks showered in a blinding cascade, shorting out the mercenaries' night vision optics. In the ensuing chaos, she fired twice more, the deafening cracks masking her movement as she dropped the closest Volkov operative before rolling to a new vantage point. But the lieutenant unleashed a blind barrage of suppressing fire, pinning her down. Concrete dust rained over her shoulders as bullets tore through the room. The metallic click of an empty magazine echoed from her weapon. She was outgunned, the heavy boot steps of the traitor closing in on her position. Then the shadows themselves seemed to come alive. A chilling familiar silhouette materialized in the smoke-filled doorway. Shin Jae-won hadn't just survived the harbor. He had torn through the city like a god of vengeance. He didn't shout. He moved with the terrifying predatory grace of a king reclaiming his throne. His first shot took the second mercenary cleanly through the skull. His second shattered the knee of the final Volkov soldier. The lieutenant spun around, his eyes wide with absolute terror, but he was entirely too slow. Jae-won crossed the room in 3 massive strides, his hand shooting out to wrap around the traitor's throat. He lifted the man off his feet, the sheer violent power of the Mafia boss radiating like a furnace in the dark. Naomi stood up from behind the console, refusing to look away from the brutality. Jaewon's chest heaved, his dark suit stained with the blood of his enemies. He didn't look at the man dying in his grip. His dark, obsessive eyes found Naomi, sweeping over her with a frantic, burning intensity. When he saw she was unharmed, standing tall amidst the carnage with her chin raised, a dark, lethal pride flashed across his face. He executed the traitor with a brutal twist of his wrist, letting the body drop to the floor. The physical threat was neutralized, leaving only the heavy, electric gravity between two equals standing in the ruins. The storm that broke over the city that night was a fitting shroud for the massacre. Shin Jae-won did not send a strike team to the Volkov Syndicate's heavily fortified estate. He brought the war to their doorstep himself, and he did not come alone. Naomi walked beside him through the torrential rain, shedding the last remnants of her invisible life. She was dressed in sleek, tactical black, the heavy weight of a suppressed weapon resting against her thigh. They moved not as a king and his captive, but as apex predators hunting as one. The perimeter guards fell in silence, neutralized by Jae-won's chilling mechanical efficiency. He moved through the shadows like a force of nature, an unstoppable monster whose legendary cruelty had finally found a righteous purpose. Every bullet he fired, every throat he crushed, was a testament to his dark devotion to the woman at his side. He cleared the path, his massive frame shielding her from the crossfire as they breached the opulent, marble-floored foyer of the Volkov manor. They found the architect of her nightmares cowering in his private study. Alexander Volkov, the man who had ordered her father's execution a decade ago, stared in absolute terror as the heavy mahogany doors splintered inward. The Russian boss scrambled for the gold-plated revolver on his desk, but Jae-won was faster. A single, deafening shot shattered Volkov's wrist, sending the weapon clattering to the floor. Volkov collapsed to his knees, clutching his bleeding arm as Jae-won stalked toward him. The Korean kingpin radiated a suffocating lethal authority, his dark eyes devoid of mercy. He placed the barrel of his gun against the Russian's temple, forcing him to look up. But Jae-won didn't pull the trigger. He stepped back, keeping his heavy boot planted firmly on Volkov's chest, and looked at Naomi. This was her vengeance. Her justice. Naomi stepped into the dim light of the study, the ghosts of her past silencing the storm outside. Volkov's eyes widened as he finally recognized the daughter of the accountant he had slaughtered. She didn't tremble. She didn't hesitate. Naomi drew her weapon, her posture mirroring the absolute, terrifying calm of the man standing beside her. "You made me a ghost," Naomi said, her voice a quiet, lethal blade that sliced through the whimpering of the broken syndicate leader. "But ghosts always come back to haunt." She pulled the trigger. The deafening crack echoed through the manor, severing the chains of her past in one violent, definitive heartbeat. Justice was bloody, but as Naomi lowered her weapon, the suffocating weight she had carried for 10 years vanished. Jae-won stepped into her space, his massive hand wrapping securely around the nape of her neck. He pulled her flesh against his chest, grounding her in the aftermath of the carnage. The monsters of her past were dead, and the most dangerous man in the city had just laid his violent empire at her feet. 6 months after the fall of the Volkov Syndicate, the Luminary Hotel's penthouse was no longer a gilded cage. It was the throne room of an undisputed empire. Naomi stood by the newly repaired floor-to-ceiling windows, the dark server uniform she once used as armor long replaced by a breathtaking, tailored gown that swept the marble floor. She looked out over the glittering city skyline, not as a hidden ghost running from her past, but as the untouchable queen of its shadows. The heavy doors opened, and Shin Jae-won stepped into the room. He moved with the same terrifying, predatory grace that commanded absolute fear in the underworld, his sharp black suit absorbing the ambient light. But the frigid, isolated monster, who had once viewed people merely as disposable tools, was gone. In his place stood a man profoundly altered by sacrifice and fierce loyalty. The brutal kingpin who had once demanded unquestioning submission, had found his redemption in the unyielding fire of the woman waiting for him. He crossed the expanse of the room, his dark eyes fixed on her with a consuming, possessive heat. He didn't stop until he was flush against her back, his massive chest a solid protective wall behind her, his arms wrapped securely around her waist, pulling her into his intoxicating warmth as he pressed a lingering kiss to the curve of her neck. "The Eastern Territories have officially surrendered their shipping routes," Jae-won murmured, his gravelly voice vibrating against her collarbone. Your restructuring of the front companies worked flawlessly. No one dares breathe a word against us. Naomi leaned back into his embrace, her hands resting over his. They fear you, she said softly, turning her head slightly to catch his gaze in the reflection of the glass. They fear us, Jae-won corrected, his tone leaving no room for debate. He turned her slowly in his arms, his large hands coming up to gently cup her face. The absolute authority that defined him in the streets melted entirely when he looked at her. Once he had believed that caring for someone was a fatal weakness, a vulnerability that would ultimately destroy his reign. Now, he knew that his obsessive devotion to her was the very foundation of his true strength. He had sacrificed his cold isolation, willingly laying his violent empire at her feet to ensure her survival. Naomi reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. The dangerous attraction that had sparked with a desperate whisper in a crowded dining room had forged an unbreakable bond of blood and trust. They had survived betrayal, dismantled their enemies, and rebuilt a kingdom where they bowed to no one. Jae-won leaned down, capturing her lips in a deep, consuming kiss that tasted of power and dark promises. He would always be a ruthless mafia boss to the rest of the world, but in the sanctuary of their shadows he was entirely hers. Together they ruled the night bound by an unyielding love, an equal partnership, and a dark reign that no enemy could ever break.